Hey guys, thanks so much for joining. So today we have a debate slash conversation with Godless Engineer and Caleb Jackson, and it's all about if can historical testimony justify a miracle. So here we go. All right, so we got the one and only Godless Engineer. Appreciate you coming, and then Caleb. Appreciate you coming. One and only Caleb Jackson. So, guys, can a historical testimony justify a miracle? And I know we talked about it a little bit before. We're going to give a brief opening statement on it, on each other. Honestly, there's not much of a time limit. This is more of a conversation, anyways. I want you guys to be able to substantiate your points very well, however you want to. I don't even care. This is just more like a conversation, which is what I like to do. So, Caleb, we're going to start with you. So, whenever you are ready, just go ahead and take it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Did we want to do introductions first, or are we just going right into it?
Definitely introduce yourself, and then if you want to share your screen, do anything like that, I'm here for you.
So I'm Caleb Jackson, as he had said. I call myself a theological hobbyist, so I'm not currently studying anything related to philosophy or theology, but I do find it interesting, and I have written some pop level books on it. I'm currently writing a fairly large book on the topic of miracles and miracle claims, and so that's what sponsored this concept for this discussion that we were having today. I think Hunter originally had suggested doing a debate on the New Testament or the historicity of Jesus, but that would have, knowing John, is that's kind of his area, and he's done a lot of stuff on that. That would take a very long time for me to prep, and I was not going about to do that in 3 days. So, so I was like, yeah, let's just do it.
John's like, you dodged the bullet.
I did, yeah. That would be a lot of Richard Carrier to read that I don't have time to. So, yeah. That's mine. John can go to introduce himself while I'm getting this set up if he wants.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So I'm John Gleason, the Godless Engineer. I have social media stuff everywhere: Facebook, YouTube, X/Twitter, all those places. I'm just Godless Engineer, and I pretty much just produce content for the other side of the conversation, being that I'm atheist, and so I just engage in topics like today, as well as the historicity of Jesus. And just other topics in the sphere of atheism where that intersects with just everything. So yeah, that's pretty much me. If you like what I'm saying here today, just find me wherever you're at socially, I guess.
Yep. Which, by the way, for anybody who is watching this live or after, whenever, wherever you're watching this, both links to both of the speakers today are down in the description. So Godless Engineer, his YouTube is down there, and there's a link to his website and everything else. That's how you can find him. Also, Caleb and his writing and his books are also in the descriptions. Definitely check them both out. I've been, checking them out and looking at everything that they do, and it's just really great work in what they're doing, both of them. So definitely check them out. Which you guys, everybody who knows me, knows my name's Hunter. Bit of a headache, so I'm not going to try to be too involved, but at the same time, if I just want to carry on the conversation, then I'm just here because this is what I love to do after all. So cool. And I see, Caleb, you have your screen here, so let me go ahead and share this for you. Do you got something to say?
No, I was just gonna say, I don't know if John, is his mic a little blown out to you?
Yeah, I think something switched on your end there, Hunter, because you went silent for a bit and then it changed to a different mic, so you're a lot louder right now.
This is how you know we're doing it live. It's clearly not pre-recorded, so that's what happens when you do it like that. It's keeping it real.
Is that better? Is this better?
I don't think it's as clear, but it's not like cutting out. So
how's that?
That's good. Just lower the volume a little bit, maybe slightly.
Let me see. I will do that. All right, so I'll go on mute while you do that. So let's go ahead and share your screen. Guys, you always know when it comes to live streams, there's always going to be some form of technical difficulties. Just we don't live in a perfect world, unfortunately. So, but all right. So, Caleb, share this for you.
Okay, so let me know because I'm looking at mine right now. So I'm going to slideshow. So is that full screen to everyone else? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, yeah, as we said, the topic today we're discussing kind of history, testimony, and miracle claims. Can historical testimony, in theory, justify a miracle claim? I'm not necessarily here to defend every miracle claim in the Bible, regardless of whether or not I actually accept those as legitimate. But we're talking about more about epistemology and historical method in terms of how would we or could we even establish a miracle by this way. So first of all, how are we defining a miracle? We often hear people say, oh, my child was born, it was a miracle. Well, that's sweet, but that's not how most philosophers or theologians are defining the term miracle in this case. Miracle, I think, was defined very well by Robert Larmer, a philosopher, who writes, it is an unusual and religiously significant event which reveals and furthers God's purposes, is beyond the power of physical nature to produce in the circumstance in which it occurs, and is caused by an agent that transcends physical nature. So really there's three elements that we see in this definition. One is that it is a religiously significant event, that is two, that it's caused by God, and three, that it's something that has an irregularity that transcends the normal laws of nature. So people often think of that when you think of walking on water or turning water into wine or ascending into heaven and so forth. These are things that aren't normally with standard laws of physics and so forth as we know them. And so people appeal to supernatural agents. Now, it is true that if you look in ancient history, certainly Christianity is not the only religion with miracles. There's plenty of other ancient religions that one can look at. You can look at the cures of Vespasian through the Egyptian god Serapis, where when he's in Egypt, he allegedly, according to Tacitus and Cassius and I think Suetonius, heals a blind man and a man who has a arm that's been injured. You have the resurrection and ascension of Aristeas, which is mentioned by Herodotus, who dies in a wood chipper's shop and is seen. He disappears and appears before people again. You have Apollonius of Tyana, who was a miracle worker contemporary with Jesus, who also allegedly healed people and exorcised demons and disappeared in front of his followers and so forth. And you have, which I have pictured here on the right, Honi the circle drawer, who was a Jewish rabbi who allegedly drew a circle during a drought and prayed to God, and all the rain came pouring down. This is according to Josephus, the Jewish historian. And he basically was able to control the weather through the power of God, at least according to this story. So how would we have all these stories, but how do we know if any of these claims are legitimate, right? We have this idea. Would this be enough to verify it? Well, I think that I would agree, and I'm sure John would say this, we should not just take all testimony of this kind just at face value. We should not just say, yeah, miracles can happen. So someone tells me that, sure, I believe them, no questions asked. We should be skeptical and critical, and we should look into these. Now, I would argue that we don't just dismiss them outright, but that we can look at it. So there's a couple criteria that I think we can set, and this is my version of what some other philosophers like Tim McGrew have said. I think one would be that a miracle claim is reported early and that we can trace it back to firsthand witnesses. So we want the names of witnesses in particular. We don't want, John said that Becky said that his wife's cousin saw so-and-so happen. That would just be hearsay at that point. We want as close to direct firsthand testimony as you can get. We want a miracle that occurs in a public place in front of many witnesses. So we don't want something that happened in the privacy of someone's home where only one person saw it. So most alien abduction cases are of this nature, where you don't have 500 people who see the body taken up into the spacecraft. It's usually just one or two people in the bedroom who happen to remember being abducted by aliens or so forth. You want a miracle claim that undergoes critical investigation and is not necessarily just accepted and taken at face value, but that's looked at critically. So were people asking questions? Were people interviewing witnesses? Were people saying, I don't know about that, and looking and trying to falsify it? Or was it just taken in terms of, yes, that's fine. It agrees with my preconceived religious notions, and so I'm just going to accept it. Right. You don't want a miracle that necessarily just agrees with the established opinion, because there's not going to be any kind of investigation, even attempts to falsify it. So if it was false, it'd be very difficult to know if there's no investigation. You want a miracle that's unique to a religious context. And so we don't want random things happening that are just kind of anomalies that don't have anything to do with religion, because although we could say that's really strange, we wouldn't necessarily need to think that God had anything to do with it, because there was no context. So if a unicorn would just happen to appear in the middle of Times Square, I would say that the world's probably a stranger place than I thought, but I don't think I would appeal to saying God or a supernatural being did it, because I don't have any reason to think that God or a supernatural being would have any desire to create a unicorn, unless you just got bored or something. What would be the motive to that? So we want something that's unique to religious context. So you want it to be unique to it. So we don't want an event that happens outside of a religious context, right? In terms of phenomenon that we're familiar with that happens, like, someone had a job promotion after they prayed. Well, yes, they did pray, but we know people can get job promotions without needing to pray. And so it'd be hard to connect those two dots. And lastly, we want the miracle to have occurred in conditions that are optimal for accurate reportage. So when we look at eyewitness testimony, there's various degrees of it. Some people have testimony that's very unreliable. So if an event happens when it's really dark outside from a far distance, if it involves a stranger, if it involves a robbery where there's a weapon of some kind, a very high tense adrenaline moment, like a car accident or something, people are not going to be remembering the small details. Their brains are going to misremember a lot of those details. You want something that happens very slowly, perhaps repeatedly, in optimal conditions, perhaps controlled conditions, with people who are perhaps recording this at the time and are not recollecting it later on, and so forth. So there's things we can put in place where we can try to say that there's credible testimonies and non-credible testimonies. I think these are fairly objective and reasonable standards that we can appeal to, that we'd be looking for. So when we look back at those examples I gave earlier, we see that these don't cut it. So when you look at Vespasian, first of all, Tacitus tells us that in that healing, the guy wasn't really blind. He just had something covering his eye, and the guy wasn't really paralyzed that Vespasian healed. He only had an arm that was dislocated. And so Tacitus thinks that this was just a psychosomatic kind of faith healing like you would see with Benny Hinn or other faith healers. That's not legitimately done. And of course, we don't have anyone critically investigating. We don't have people trying to falsify this. These are people who already accepted Serapis, and Vespasian was trying to vindicate his spot as emperor. And so there's that kind of self-serving motives there. Same with the resurrection of Aristeas. This was reported by Herodotus at least a century or so after the events allegedly happened, and these are passed down. There were obviously no living witnesses for Herodotus to interview, so this is oral tradition. And so that gives us quite a lot of room to doubt. Apollonius Tatiana, likewise, was written probably about a century or so by Philostratus after his death. Now, there's debate as to whether he was using earlier sources by his disciple, but we also don't have critiques of this. We don't have critical investigation. In fact, this was written up deliberately to vindicate a temple for Apollonius to compete with Christianity. So there's a lot of motive there to do it. There's not a lot of objective kind of critical investigation. And miracles by Honi the circle drawer, this is also relatively late when Josephus reports it. And likewise, this would be an event that would be kind of mundane. Rain can happen. People can get lucky. Praying for rain during a drought, although it's relatively unlikely, is not absolutely impossible. We do know rainstorms can happen. If it was raining blood or raining, fire or something, maybe that would be different. But calling rain of itself is not that impressive. So I would like to propose two main arguments here in terms of this now. So we have an argument from analogy. So it is very hard to look at these things from thousands of years ago and to verify them. I concede that. But I think we can look at analogous events in today's world and retroactively put that onto history. So Craig Keener is the most famous one who has done this in terms of looking at the data. So he cites Pew Research from about 2006, 2007, in which you can count there's hundreds of millions across the globe of charismatic Christians who believe they have seen a miracle. And that's only including charismatic Christians. That's not including non-charismatic Christians in other religions like Hindus and so forth that have a lot of miracle claims. Now, he nor I nor most people would say all of these claims are legitimate. Absolutely not. We can concede that 98% of them can be explained, perhaps by people lying, by people being mistaken, by people being credulous, and so forth. But the point is not that all of these have to be legitimate. The point is that we do have contemporary analogies to these things, and so we can't just dismiss them completely as legend per se. We need to look at them on a case-by-case basis. And we do find eyewitness testimonies today of very similar events that you'll find in the New Testament, whether it's multiplying food, healing various diseases, exorcisms, controlling the weather, so forth. Again, not saying that all of these are necessarily legitimate, but that we do have eyewitness reports of these, and so we shouldn't just necessarily dismiss them offhand. We should look into them. And by the same vein, if one does think that they can trace some historical memory to the New Testament or to the epistles of Paul, then we can apply that same standard there in that way. Another part of this argument from analogy, I think we can give an example. We do see healings that have biblical characteristics that occur today that would parallel those seen by Jesus. For example, in Mark 2, we have a story where a paralyzed man is healed by Jesus. His friends lower him to the building, right? He gets up and everyone's amazed. Now, this sounds like an incredible story. A paralyzed man walking again instantaneously at the command of prayer without, physical rehabilitation or medicine and all that stuff. That sounds quite unusual. That couldn't happen today. And yet we do have religiously significant events that have happened today. For example, Leo Perez was healed on August 27, 1978, was in a wheelchair for 20 years. During a faith healing service by the Catholic priest Ralph Diorio, he was prayed for, holy water was thrown on him, and he got out of his wheelchair and started walking again for the first time in 20 years. Now, prior to this, he had been completely paralyzed. His waist had been almost completely immobile. He had been paralyzed on his left side. He had originally had a herniated disc that he was injured from an accident, and this got worse, and a botched surgery left him completely without feeling on that side, and he had to have a cordotomy to relieve the pain. And a cordotomy is done where they don't really do it that much anymore, but in the 50s, they would do it to sever the nerves so that you'd be without pain for terminally ill patients, usually cancer patients. But this was when pain meds were not as good. So he was on pain medicine daily, even after the cordotomy, had no feeling and was completely paralyzed, had muscle atrophy, and was considered permanently disabled. And so the same at the time when he was prayed for, he gets up and starts walking, and he immediately visits his doctor that same night, actually. And his doctor's made by this. So in the press that was interviewed later, his general practitioner, Dr. Mitch Tinnerwitz, who works at the Cooley Dickinson Hospital up in Massachusetts, did interviews where he verified this and provided the medical documentation to show that Leo really had been paralyzed for 20 years. And I have the quotes up there where he says, Leo was totally paralyzed in a wheelchair for 20 years, never having use of his legs from the day of his last of 5 operations from a disc and lower back problems. His 5th operation was an operation of the relief pain, which was talking about the cordotomy, which was intractable. It was a cordotomy of the upper spine, which left him totally without sensation in the shoulders down. Afterwards, when he was healed and he visited his doctor again that same night and on follow-up examinations, without any kind of physical therapy or medication, his doctor was amazed and couldn't explain how he started walking again after being prayed for. He said, Leo's walking extremely well. His muscles have returned to a degree adequate to keep them aggregating, that to a degree is a typo, quite nicely. Sensation has returned in spite of the cordotomy. It's truly miraculous, marvelous, incredible. Before his healing, he lists all sorts of the medication for years and years. Another amazing thing about this man is that he suddenly, with his healing, stopped taking everything, all the pain meds. There was no withdrawal. He took nothing of pain, nothing for sleep. He didn't even take an aspirin. That's miraculous in of itself. So here we have a similar case where you have a person who really could not walk, and at least in this latter case was certifiably paralyzed, could not walk for 20 years, was on various pain medicines and did not have any expectation of getting better, and was instantly and completely healed after being prayed for by a miracle worker, a holy man. We do see analogies to that in the modern day, and so one can say that whatever we think of it, this is a category we can appeal to when we're talking about the New Testament or other things in ancient history. Last argument I'll make here is an argument from shared features, which is to say that if we have miracle testimonies that have sort of unintentional parallels with each other, then it might be best explained through memory. So to give an example, we have hundreds of testimonies of people who allegedly claim to have seen the 17th century Catholic priest, Joseph of Cupertino, or friar, more than a priest, levitating. I don't just mean levitating a few inches or for a few seconds, but levitating tens of feet off the air for 10, 20, 30 minutes at a time to where he'd be in a trance state and have to be lowered back down. And the weird thing about some of these testimonies is that they would mention that his clothes would be very tight on him when he was doing this, which you would think that levitating, your clothes would be hanging from the gravity, right? They'd be very loose, like when you're falling in that way. And I have the quote there. But when you look at other accounts that are, as far as we can tell, probably independent from people like Jerome and others, when they're talking about people who are demon-possessed who are levitating, which is quite an extraordinary claim, he mentions the same thing about how when they're levitating, they'll levitate upside down, and yet their clothes, their skirts don't fall on top of them with gravity. They just stay straight and stiff, which is not something that you really expect if someone was floating. So these details aren't really explained, but the fact that we seem to have 2 or 3 different reports mentioning this weird detail indicates that this really could be deriving from a memory. It's unlikely this would just be a coincidence, and it's unlikely that this was intentionally redacted on behalf of Joseph witnesses to try to compare him to a demonic possession in that kind of way. So I think the best explanation here is that there is some kind of memory to explain these details. So last thing we'll go over is explanations. Okay, so let's say that we can verify that something happened with certain testimonies in history, but what do we think of it? Do we dismiss it? There seems to be lots of possibilities. How would we rule out deception, that people were just lying? Well, it depends on how many witnesses you have. If those witnesses don't have an interest in spreading this message, if they're just relatively third parties, independents like doctors, and they're impartial, and if the witness has been shown to be credible in other cases. So that would make this outright deception very unlikely. Legend hypothesis, where people just pass on stories and so forth through orally without checking them, you're going to need to trace it back to make sure you have first-hand accounts and it's not just passed on. That way you can get the details and it's not exaggerated as much. And that, what about people who mistakenly or inaccurately report things, where they exaggerate or misremember things? Well, again, this is going to depend on the case, but it depends on the situation. So if you have multiple witnesses, you can rule out just one person. You can see how the details coincide. You want controlled conditions like medical scenarios, like we saw with Leo's case, where a doctor is studying it with, modern medicine, medical technology, where it's not just a quick glance in memory. It's looking at records that were written down at the time and any other professional sense that you'd have. And of course, the particular details of the event. So if we look at Joseph Cupertino levitating, if it was something that happened one time, a few inches off the ground for 2 seconds, that could very easily be exaggerated, misremembered. But it's very, very hard to be mistaken if you have 2, 3, 4, 5 people say, yes, we also saw Joseph levitating in the air for 30 minutes, 20 feet off the ground unaided. That's not going to be something you are just going to easily misremember in terms of, oh, he just hopped up for 2 seconds. I just happened to get that detail wrong. That's going to be something that's really hard to get wrong, and it's that extensive. And of course, what about an unknown natural mechanism? Maybe there's just some natural law out there that we just don't know why it happens, but we'll discover it one day, right? You can say lightning we thought was caused by Zeus, but now we know it's not. It's caused by activity in the atmosphere and so forth. Well, again, it depends on the situation, but I would say that if we have something that occurs exclusively in a religious context, which lightning does not, that would be partial evidence for it being a theistic explanation. And it also depends on if it has natural features that are unlike a normal healing, a normal event. And that's what's called the Lambertini criteria, which I have not gone over in this speech, but I have gone over in other pieces of work. And so the theistic explanation, is God a better explanation for some of these phenomenon? Well, I would say that if there's a God, by definition, he's all powerful, all good, all knowing. This is just going by the classical definition of God in that sense. And I think that it's likely, plausible that a God who is perfectly good and so forth would want a world with miracles, because it would allow him to show his mercy and love on people who are suffering, and it would allow him to vindicate messages. So you'd be able to know, oh, this is from God, this is God's prophet, this is God saying this, and it's not an imposter, because we know people fake things all the time. We know that people have imposters in false religions. So miracles are stamping for God to say, this is the correct one. We can do things they can't, right? And miracles contain these benefits, but of course we don't have a world where it's only miracles, where all prayers are always answered, because then there would be no triumphs for us to overcome. There would be no evils for us to have to defeat. We wouldn't be able to have much free will. Everything would kind of just be handed to us. We'd be spoiled. So we live in a world where there's a lot of hurt, a lot of stuff we have to overcome. But of course, there's still miracle reports every once in a while. They don't happen so frequently to where we can't have a normal process in life, but they don't happen so rarely to where we don't have any credible accounts either, as I would argue. And so I think this is consistent with the theistic hypothesis. So the data that we see many miracle claims, many of them admittedly not credible, but some of them really interesting and really hard to disprove, really well documented, are consistent with the idea of there being a all-powerful God who wants to perform these things for the reasons I already gave. And so I would say that miracles are better predicted and better explained under theism than atheism. So those are basically all my 3 points. Not all miracle claims should be believed, but we have those criteria to look at which one should or shouldn't. Modern parallels do establish a precedent that we can put in our background information to say we do have these kinds of weird events that happen after prayer that we can't explain. So if they happen today on occasion, why not think they happened back then on occasion? And in many cases, we know that I would say theistic explanations do have superior predictive and explanatory power than the natural alternatives. So yes, I would say that in certain cases, historical testimony could, in principle, verify a miracle claim to lead to belief in the supernatural. So that's my opening statement. So
Good stuff. All right, and I don't know if I'm still loud or not. Am I still loud? Can you guys hear me?
You're good.
Yep.
Good. Okay, awesome. All right, cool. Good introduction. And then John, if you want to share, you say you don't have a PowerPoint, right? No. Okay, cool. Well then, yep. Just go on ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm more interested in the discussion part, because I feel like that's where a lot of the work actually gets done. So that's why I opted to have a fairly short and concise sort of opening statement here about miracles and historical evidence for miracles. I am a methodological naturalist, so I feel like if anything is happening in reality, then it should be detectable and should be quantifiable in reality through some kind of scientific means, through either empirical evidence or something of that nature. I feel like you would need a lot of evidence in order to prove that something supernatural exists. So, I mean, I feel like you'd have to first start off by proving that the supernatural exists in order to be able to get to miracles happening and being the best explanation for a particular event. Basically, my position is that if it happens in reality, then it should be quantifiable in reality, and we should be able to describe it in reality. And if we have to appeal to something outside of reality, then that's I guess I don't know how to comprehend that particular thing, because if it's happening within reality, then it has to be describable within reality. And so I have problems with that. And I do have a number of issues, that I was carefully taking notes, or at least trying to, during the opening. So I have a lot of problems with that. Where my main problems really lie in this being proof for like a god, or it being evidence of a god, however you want to describe the god, is how do you discern your particular miracles from other people's miracles that seem to prove their particular deities? And like what is the discerning aspect of that? Because I feel like once we get into that area, you get into a lot of cherry picking and specially pleading for a particular definition of God and for particular miracle events. Because as everybody knows, every religion out there has miracle claims, like Hinduism, Buddhism. They all have these healing miracle claims. They have miracle claims concerning like statues. I believe in it's either Hinduism or Buddhism. They have miracles where statues will consume milk, and there's also miracles where oil will appear on statues, and that seems to be some kind of divine anointing that they perceive. And all of these, I feel like all of these definitely would match the miracle definition provided by Caleb in his opening here. So I feel like we definitely need a methodology for discerning between those miracles and the miracles that we are discussing here for this tri-omni God. And so I have problems with being able to make that to discern between those two. I have a lot of issues with, because this particular event happened, let's say it's supernatural, how exactly does that prove any certain definition of a God, kind of thing, which I think Caleb did a fairly good job of sort of boxing in this idea of miracles to one particular deity, and like setting up criteria that where it's only prayers to one particular deity that proves that that deity did something. But I still feel like there's a bit of a logic gap there with, oh, this happened, a prayer happened, prior to that. So that means that these two things are connected, because I can totally see instances where somebody's like, oh, I prayed to God and then this thing happened, and therefore that means a miracle happened. And then there's the idea of all the witnesses. I still feel like it's more likely that people can be just simply wrong, even if they completely believe in these miracles, completely believe in the supernatural aspect of it. I still think that they can be wrong just because of how our brains work and how easily people can be fooled into either false memories or be fooled into thinking that something happened when it really didn't. I think the proclivity of that happening is definitely going to always be vastly more likely than a miracle happening. So, that's pretty much where I stand, and I can't wait to get into the discussion, which I know my opening's far less impressive than Caleb's opening, but I was really interested to hear Caleb's defense of miracles, so I'm glad that he was able to get all that out and set this in the appropriate context. But again, I'm more interested in the discussion part, so that's why I opted for this.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, just for the record, you had a good introduction as well. So you led a good foundation explaining your points. Both of you did really good. I also took notes from both of you, and I got lists. I'm kind of a fast typer myself. And so pretty much
you didn't have to take notes from mine. I could have just sent it to you, right? It would have
No,
been
it's okay.
easier for you.
Nah, I like when I take notes, it helps me memorize stuff easier. Haha, see what I did there? Anyways, so going into the conversation, so John, you're the one that seems to you see more. What was it that you said? That there was a logic gap. in between
Mhm.
what Caleb is talking about. So I guess we can start with that, where we're talking about boxing miracles to one particular deity. And then Caleb, you opened up with multiple examples of other miracles happening. And yeah, those aren't as attested. So I think that would be a good place to maybe start. If you guys, I don't know if you guys agree with that or not, but
Yeah, it's fine.
so to Caleb, just to kind of start it off, how is it that from the one miracle claim of, say, the deity of God
Mhm.
to all these other religious miracles, what constitutes those as being more reliable than the other ones without
Yeah.
performing a logic gap?
Yeah, no, that's fair. And in fairness, I wasn't trying to, like, at least for the sake of this debate, argue that like it's a particular deity, like all the religion's wrong. You could, I'm not defending this position, but one could be a pluralist and say, well, it's a God who just thinks all religions are inclusive and just wants to help people, doesn't care, right? I wouldn't personally defend that, but one could say that. But no, I would say that that's why it's a great question. It's a very common question. That's why I tried to start off with talking about these kind of criteria that I think we could put in this place and look at in terms of assessing likely from unlikely. And so I completely concede, by the way, with a lot of these criteria, and that many, if not most of the miracles of the Bible even wouldn't pass this. So I'm perfectly fine with conceding that for the sake of argument in that way. So I think that these are fairly objective. I don't know, John, do you have any issues? Do you need to see those again? I don't know if you had written them down in terms of those criteria.
You're talking about the criteria for miracle claims?
The criteria for the testimony in terms of like assessing like more credible from less credible. That was on like the second slide, I think, second or third slide.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have criteria for miracle claims, which includes early firsthand witnesses.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, early firsthand witnesses, I mean, I feel like all of this really relies on the idea that, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but a lot of this kind of seemed to really rely on the idea that if there are early witnesses to it, and there's a lot of people that say similar things, that they can't just be wrong about it. And I feel like having that assumption in there kind of taints your conclusion a bit, because I mean, there's several different things in the past where, all of these people experience this thing, so there's no way that it can be wrong. Like the one that's coming to mind is, I believe it was in, maybe it was Spain or Portugal, but it's the sun dancing in the sky.
Fatima, yeah. Portugal, yeah.
Portugal. And I mean, sure. I mean, a lot of people saw it and everything like that, but I still feel like, considering how the sun, what we know about the sun and what we know about physics, I feel like it's far more likely that these people all just sort of were influenced, or they just experienced something that seemed similar, and they just fabricated something in their mind, and they're just simply wrong about it. Like, I think that they fully believed in whatever they experienced, but I still feel like the proclivity for people to just be wrong about things is far greater than actual supernatural things happening.
Yeah, and I don't even disagree with the first statement that you had said there. And that's why I was, just to be clear, I'm not saying that each of those criteria by itself like vindicate it, but I think it is there. So that's why the fourth or fifth one I had on there was optimal conditions for observing it, right? So Fatima would pass the first one because we do have firsthand testimonies to it, but it wouldn't pass that fourth one because people were expecting a miracle. People were looking in the sky, and if you're staring at the sun for a few minutes, you're going to see some weird things, right? So it's not, I don't think it's that difficult to, and we actually have observed this, by the way, in other contexts, where people look at the sun and see like double vision, stuff like that. So I don't think it would even pass the third criteria either. So you do have issues with that. So I'm saying when you add those all up collectively, that's when it gets there. So yeah, you can have religion that fulfills one or two, but if it misses out on the other ones, it hampers it. So I think at minimum it needs to get all of those together, and then we can look and look at it more closely. But yeah, I don't even disagree that people can, in principle, be deceived and come to false conclusions. But it depends on the circumstances, right? Like when you have a circumstance of someone, as I mentioned the example, who was paralyzed for 20 years, and this isn't just like, oh, I know, or I just watch it, but you have medical evidence of like, oh, he has a doctor's appointments, they perform these tests, and that would be perfectly acceptable in any court of law in terms of a doctor testifying to a patient. We do that all the time with medical malpractice suits and stuff like that. That's harder to be mistaken about because it's in controlled conditions and it's not just happened once really quickly. It's repeated observations over a number of time, right? So I think that would be better. That would be a better example than someone who just saw something happen one time in a group hysteria like Fatima, I think.
Right. So let's go with the Leo Paris thing, because I tried to look up, like, while you were talking about the Leo Paris thing, I tried looking it up, and the only thing that came up on the internet are crank websites.
Well, it's not from
this guy.
Yeah, it's from it's from a book by a psychologist, actually, is the primary source, which I can send you if you want. It's actually on Internet Archive. A book, I think it's from the late 80s or so. And some websites take that and do other stuff with it. But.
So let me ask this: how is that a critical investigation? Like, because in everything that you had said, like, there's claims about a doctor verifying this, but there's no actual doctors. Like, I didn't expect you to have this in your presentation, but just coming from a more skeptical sort of point of view, what I would expect to see are like doctor's notes or doctors like lab reports or something like that. And as far as like going for a critical investigation, as it kind of seems right now, all we have is anecdotal evidence of, oh, hey, this guy says that he couldn't walk for 20 years, but now he can. And that you have to understand that seems a whole lot like all of these faith healing con men out there that find somebody that can technically be called paralyzed or blind or some other kind of ailment, but in reality that, you know, they can get up and they can walk around and everything like that. So if you get them appropriately energized with enough brain chemicals going on there to, you know, push down that pain, you can make it seem like they're all healed now, but then they're really not. So just from a skeptical point of view, it more seems like it's just another faith healing con man that is trying to con people into believing in this faith healing snake oil.
Yeah, no, that's a good clarifying question. So yeah, obviously I did not have, I did have the quotes from it, but I didn't have the documents in front of me for the sake of this presentation. But in the book, I do have more extensive quotes, and most of that comes from Paul Rode, who was a psychologist who had this in a book, and he talked to the doctor, and there's also other newspapers, which I didn't cite here, that I can give you if you want, from the time, who interviewed his physicians and so forth. So, credible, local newspapers interviewing this. So there's not much of a question. This guy actually was his doctor and had done all this stuff. So I think that his medical history isn't overly questioned in that sense, in terms of we can talk to his doctors and give the names and the institutions they work for and so forth, and people have, and media outlets have, in that sense, and get that kind of information. So in terms of now, we could say maybe that really did happen, and maybe it's just some weird phenomenon. Maybe it's just people happen to get better, but that's when we would need to look at the details in terms of, okay, this was instantaneous, even though he also didn't have muscles, by the way. After that, he was still severely atrophied. He did eventually build up the muscles again about, 3 months or so after the healing, but he was able to walk in spite of that initially, until he built up the muscles. So, but chordotomies and so forth don't typically go away. You can get chordotomies that have, typically if you get it for pain, most people who get chordotomies die within a few years because they're terminally ill. But you do have cases where people live longer than that, and sometimes the pain comes back, but they're still left numb in their feet or their side or whatever. So the fact that he also regained feeling from that is remarkable, and to my knowledge doesn't normally happen with the chordotomy. And the fact that he was completely morphine dependent immediately after that. So you have all these different factors of morphine independence, feeling back from the chordotomy, ability to walk despite muscle atrophy, mobility in legs, and disappearance of hemiplegia, all of that stuff in combination at the moment of prayer, completely permanently. And he died in 2004, by the way. This was the 70s, so he stayed healed for another 20, 30 years. I think all that combined is quite remarkable and should be taken seriously, and does serve as an adequate parallel to some of the things we see in ancient history.
Well, so just quickly looking up some information here, because I'm not a medical doctor, but I found where in cases of mild muscle atrophy, individuals are still able to walk, and then in more severe cases of muscle atrophy, walking without assistance can be challenging or impossible. But that doesn't even if you have severe muscle atrophy, just naturally, you may still be able to walk even if it's challenging. So I don't see how this is miraculous, that this story. So just from a skeptical point of view, it just the Leo Paris thing, I feel like it just needs a whole lot more information, and it seems like the only source that we have for it is this one psychologist book. And so
Two
I
books
would just
actually, but yeah,
okay.
That's the one I knew at the top of my head, Paul Rhodes' book. But I have the other one cited. But with the muscle atrophy thing, that is true. It depends on the extent of it. Although he had been atrophied for 20 or so years, and most people who do get this, who are severely atrophied, typically do require physical therapy and so forth to regain that back. So it's not just the atrophy. I mean, if it was just that, you could maybe make the case, but it was that, and he also had no feeling from the chordotomy, and he had the nerves were damaged from the butchered surgery that he had, which is why he was immobile in the first place, which led to the atrophy because his legs weren't being used. That's why he had the atrophy. So it's a combination of those various factors of different spinal cord problems and stuff like that. So, but those are all, I think, good points to look at. And I know it's difficult to do this with the limited information we have there. So in hindsight, I probably should have sent you this beforehand, but I'm glad that we're able to bounce off of that. But I did have I'm sorry, did you want to keep going, or am I allowed to ask questions as well?
Well, if John, if you definitely want to respond to anything he just said,
Yeah, he's
by all
welcome
means.
to respond to anything I just said.
Because I wanted to ask a question afterwards.
No, I mean, I still remain skeptical of it. Like, I feel like a good position for anybody to hold on this particular thing is not to like just immediately accept claims of this nature. It's always good to want more information and get more information, and then after careful consideration, make a decision. Currently, right now, I feel like it's more likely that he just wasn't as paralyzed as maybe reported, or maybe his doctors. I don't know what his doctors were doing. It kind of seems like the Leo Paris thing might have been in sort of not. I don't mean third world country as like a derogatory thing, but I'm just saying. Yeah, I know. But it kind of seems like it definitely comes from an area where there's not exactly as rigorous of reporting or rigorous medical stuff. Maybe. I mean, I'm not exactly sure. But in any case, I would just need more information about it in order to make a conclusion. That's all.
Yeah, no, it did happen in Massachusetts, but I mean, that's
Massachusetts.
Everything else you said. Yeah, no, that's fair. Everything else you said is fine. Well, I mean, those New Englanders are backwaters anyway, so we can't. But
well, real quick,
well,
real quick, just to kind of bring it to because you mentioned that there's two sources for the particular claim. So my curiosity.
Two like of the large ones. There's other. That's not including other like newspaper, local publications and stuff at the time. But
sure,
that's yeah. So
sure.
But go ahead and keep.
So when it comes to a localized event, something that is not, especially when you see things in ancient history that are proclaimed historical, they're acclaimed historical miracles, right? They're written down and they're localized to a specific geographical area where main population isn't really there in most of these cases here. So when it comes to these kind of claims, ultimately the question would be is how many sources do we ultimately need in order to substantiate something that's very localized in a geographical place? Because like what Caleb is saying, there's two main sources about it, but there's also news articles about it. There's witnesses about it. So ultimately, how do we substantiate on how many sources is ultimately needed given the basis of miracle claims? And that's for both of you. So whoever wants to take it.
How many sources do we need for any given miracle claim? Is that the question?
Sure. In order to substantiate it as a legitimate, reliable, or in other words, to actually take it seriously in any way, shape, or form, how many sources do we ultimately need? And so, Caleb, how many sources would you say you would need in order to substantiate something as to be taken seriously? Do you just need one?
Typically, I think you would usually need more than one. I mean, I think it's always preferable, and I don't think most, like usually if you're doing something in science, you wouldn't take on the testimony of just one person, typically, right? Usually it's peer reviewed and attempted to be replicated. Now that's not always feasible to do, and you do have cases where people publish a paper on a case study that can't really be replicated, nor is it extensively witnessed. But generally, I think it would be better to have that, and so it depends. It also depends on the nature of them. So I would rather have let's say if it was like with the healing miracle, like the Leo Paris thing, I would rather have like 2 or 3 doctors and him than I would have 10 witnesses, but they're all like they're not medically trained. They don't know the details. They could be, because I think those would just be less credible because it'd be easier for them to be mistaken about something. So it really does depend on the circumstances, but I would say you would want at least several really credible witnesses in optimal viewing conditions, right? That's kind of the general standard. And I think those seem to me to be very reasonable conditions.
And this is just a comment that was in the chat as well, just to kind of bring it. And by the way, if anybody says anything in the chat, I made it to where they have to subscribe to me first to say anything. So they really got to like me in order to
you stop
say
all
anything.
the hate mail, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's because that's how it works. No, I'm just kidding. So, and that's and John, I definitely want you to answer to, I want you to get just as much time answering all these questions. Just another thing, before Caleb, if I know you wanted to ask some questions. Plan Against Bulldog says, so it seems like John's epistemology rules out miracle claims a priori. Wouldn't that make the important point in this conversation discussing the epistemology as opposed to discussing particular cases? And so I just wanted to bring that up, given that kind of idea.
Well,
yeah, so go ahead.
Well, I mean, I would say that I haven't necessarily ruled out miracles. I feel like miracles would require a suspension of the natural order of reality. Is that like a bad assumption there, Caleb, or would you agree?
I would probably use the word intervention. Suspension makes me think that you're like the laws of physics just stopped working for a certain moment. And I think that's a little misleading. I would say it's God just intervening in that way, but it is a difficult way to quantify that.
Well, I mean, if God intervenes, doesn't he have to suspend the natural order of reality in order for him to intervene? Because like a lot of these things you're talking about as far as miracles go, they work counter to physics,
Well, I would say physics. I mean, physics and science in general relies on closed systems typically when you make a statement. So when you're saying an object in motion stays in motion, that obviously doesn't apply if a ball is falling and I happen to catch it. Did I defy the laws of gravity? No, the laws of gravity only apply if there's not another force preventing it from happening, right? Or even if you said, is it impossible for a virgin woman we'll say human, because I know animals can, to conceive and give birth? You might say, yeah, it would be. And it's like, okay, what if she was artificially inseminated? Oh, okay, now it is. But that's not a miracle, obviously. That's just, a virgin woman by herself, unless you're having something else intervening to do that, right? So yeah, now we're having condition of, if something intervenes, it can happen, right? So the theist is saying, that's what we're arguing. We're just saying God is the one who happens to do it. We agree that people don't rise from the dead ordinarily, but we're saying that God intervenes, right?
If I can interrupt real quick,
yeah.
As far as Newton's first law of motion, as far as like a primary component to physics, the actual law states an object at rest remains at rest, and an object in motion remains in motion, which is what you said, but it continues with at a constant speed and in a straight line unless acted on by an unbalanced force. So I mean, that's what you described there is still in line with physics. So no, I wouldn't say that you broke the rule because you followed the rule. Same thing with the virgin woman or whatever. Like that's still like you're still following physics there with the IVF. So I mean, I don't see how any of that is really comparable to miracles by God.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying God is doing the same thing, except for he just is an agent who's outside of it. So I don't think God is breaking the rule. If God happens to stop a ball that's falling and levitates it, I don't think that's breaking the laws of physics because it's being acted on by an outside force. So I don't think it's inconsistent with Newton saying. The only difference is that we don't have the ability to do that in terms of we can't intervene the same way God can.
Right, but I mean, shouldn't we be able to detect that force? Like if God is working within physics, then we should be able to describe these things with physics. If he's not stopping how physics works normally or how the natural world works normally in order to do his intervention, then we, at that point, it would be indistinguishable from just natural shit happening. Sorry, I didn't mean to curse on your channel there. Normal,
it doesn't
natural stuff happening.
Now, if it starts a cuss storm, that's where I started. Okay, we got you, but I don't care.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can. I think that is a really interesting question in terms of let's say that Jesus was walking in water, and we could somehow measure the water under it and see if there was like a slight inch of gravity of them hovering over it or something, or the water genetic, like not genetically, molecularly different than normal water. I think that in principle it could be, but then you would just ask, well, why is it that the water suddenly like added all these atoms in? So I think it could be consistent with the natural laws, but it would be the case where you would have a sudden change that would be inexplicable. It's like if something set on fire for no reason, like in a not a warm environment. If my couch just set on fire and we couldn't find any other cause, like there's nothing in the laws of physics that say a couch can't set on fire, but it wouldn't be explained in terms of why the atoms happen to combust the way they did, because normally you would need some external thing to do that, right? So I would imagine it'd be in that situation. Now, I don't think in most cases we can observe the effect happening in real time, but you can in cases like of healing. You can measure pre and post, like, oh, the bone filled in the gap or something like that. And I do think that does appear like it would be normal, but what a lot of these cases you have where, like if you look at, for example, at Lourdes, France, which is where they have people who go to the spring and they allegedly believe they can be cured by the Virgin Mary there. You have a couple cases with doctors verifying where people had like huge ulcers or gaping wounds that closed like instantaneously and were scarred over. Now, you can observe and measure the scar and the closing of the wound and the cells in it and so forth, and those look normal, but it's the speed in which it happened, it's the moment in which it happened, the context, even if these people have been sick for years prior to that happens. So yeah, I think the after, pre and post effects, I think you can measure in that way. But
so well, as far as your ulcers example there, would that not be a suspension of the physical reality if an ulcer just immediately healed? Like that, I mean, that would be a suspension of how like our bodies work.
It would be a catalyst of it, I would say. Like if God is making more, if God is just creating at like a really high speed all the cells to close it within a few seconds, you could say, well, we know cells do that, but they don't do it at that rate. So God is basically speeding up the process in that kind of way, I think. Just like it's an intervention, sure, but like hypothetically, I think we could do this with medicine. Like I think the difference is just that God knows how to do it, and God has the ability to do it. Where theoretically we could come up with medicine that in principle could maybe do it that fast. I mean, we don't have it yet, right? But if we do develop that medicine, that wouldn't be a miracle. We'd be working within the natural realm. So if there are ways in which God can do that, I think God is just using ways that we don't have access to because we don't have the ability to do it, or we don't have the knowledge to do it. It still wouldn't have happened without that kind of intervention. It's still not something that would just happen on its own. It still needs either human intervention or divine intervention to happen. So,
well, but the whole idea behind that is that there's no, like, I guess drawing an analogy with your, a ball's falling through the air and then you catch it, right? You're the outside force that is stopping it and causing it to come to rest. There's an ulcer that immediately closes and heals, and there's no discernible like outside force that's causing it. There's no medicine that's been applied. There's nothing that's doing anything. And it's just the process has been speed up. That would be a suspension of how natural reality works in order for God to intervene.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if a catalyst is the same thing as a suspension. Now, I agree that we couldn't detect God himself like we see this force causing it. I think you would observe, you can observe the after effects, obviously, of the wound being closed. But if you could somehow in real time actually observe the cells being created, I think you would just see these cells either being created at a very fast rate or ex nihilo or so forth very, very quickly. And I guess ex nihilo would be a violation of laws of nature. But let's say it wasn't. Let's say it was just they were reproducing at a crazy rate. I don't know if I would call it a suspension of the laws of nature. I think we would call that just God intervene. Like we've been able to do experiments where we can slow down the speed of light, right? I don't think I would call that a miracle if it's in a laboratory setting. But it's not the case that the speed of light just happens to slow down from time to time. I know there's relativity and stuff like that to look for. But if we happen to do that, I don't think it would be a miracle. So if God happens to slow down the speed of light through his power, it would be a miracle because he's intervening on it. But I don't think that's us doing it would be analogous in that way, or it would be problematic in that way. But I know how it can get confusing metaphysically in that sense.
And also to bring it back, so bring it back to my question before, so that we can bring it back off of the specifics. And
my camera messed up. No, my camera messed up. I'm still there.
We lost him. He's gone.
Yeah.
Okay, so Caleb, you answered the question about how many it would take, because we talked about the two main sources, and then other sources as well. So, John, to you, like, how many sources do we ultimately need for something to be attainable as to be taken seriously in the realm of a historical testimony to justify a miracle ultimately?
Well, I mean, I think that, anecdotal evidence is probably the worst evidence that you can have. So I don't think that any amount of witnesses can solidly justify any kind of supernatural miracle, happening in reality. I would think that you would need like empirical evidence to show that it's, in my view, and I know Caleb disagrees with this, but in my view, a suspension of the natural order of things for this miracle to happen. I think that you would need some kind of empirical evidence, something that's outside of ourselves, something that we can objectively point to show, oh, this thing did happen. Like in the ulcer example that we just went through, having meticulous, documentation of the healing rate and, all of these different things that, would show, oh, like here, it instantaneously within 1/30th of a second, instantly healed. And, here are all the readings for it and everything like that. I feel like that would be harder to explain naturally than than just somebody being like, oh, my ulcer healed as soon as I sprayed Windex on it.
Right.
Like I feel like, and let's say you had 3 doctors that were like, yep, I squirted Windex right on it, and another doctor's like, I saw him, he did it. Like I feel like the actual evidence of it would be far better than like anecdotal evidence.
I think it also, go ahead, Hunter.
No, you're good. You're good. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a good point. And I think we do make a distinction in terms of is a lot of scientific evidence is technically testimonial evidence in the sense that we're not constantly observing and having to repeat everything that's done. Like you do take it on testimony if it's sufficiently and published and the methods are good, right? So I agree. It's not just, oh, I happen to see this happen, but it would be like, okay, this patient, I've had this patient for 5 years. She's had this huge ulcer. She's had multiple surgeries and it kept opening up. It hasn't been working. And she then goes, and I was in the room and she was prayed for and it instantly closed. And then when she came back, we performed a few tests and we confirmed that, yeah, the skin really is there and all that. It wasn't makeup. We did that. And she came back a week later and it was still there. And I've followed her up on, 2 years and every time it's still there and hasn't come back. I think that would be technically testimonial, but if this was being written down in terms of, we have records like August 3rd, patient, had this ulcer, treated, didn't work, September 11th, and then you have on November 1st or something is when the miracle happened, and then you have November 2nd, she comes in the doctors and they verify it, and there's a follow-up a month later for it. That kind of evidence where it's under controlled conditions, where people are actually making these observations. It's not just having to look over like, whoa, that's weird, and then just recalling it, but actually observing it as we would with any other medical process. I think that would be very strong testimonial evidence. I don't think that John was even disagreeing with that, but I was clarifying that. So yeah, I agree that that's better evidence than people just saying they happen to see it like one time. I think because we can't, usually you're not going to be able to repeat the event itself in terms of you're not going to cut them open again and try to pray for it to close again, but the pre and post conditions were repeated. So we repeatedly observed that she did have an ulcer for this many years. We repeatedly observed that now it's closed and it hasn't come back. Those two things, the fact that she had one and now no longer has it, and the time frame, those things are repeatable, even if the actual event wasn't. But it depends on the time frame between the two in terms of that. So you'd have to look at the details.
And John, you got anything to say to that? Because Hats Off History made a kind of like a building point. John, I think you saw this. I don't know if you know this person or not by any chance, or
I know who it is.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah. Well, and John, did you have anything to say to that?
No, I mean, yeah, I would agree with what Caleb said.
Okay.
That would be far better evidence than anecdotal evidence.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then Hats Off History simply says, presumably, he's referring to Godless Engineer, referring to demonstration by evidence of greater strength. In history, there are too many things that go wrong, so it only works in the context of background knowledge about the world. So to Caleb, in regards to that specifically, when it comes to context of background knowledge about the world, history, has been wrong in the past. History, there are too many things that go wrong. So how do we justify a miracle on historical testimony, if that's the case?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say, first of all, it depends on your background knowledge. I think John and I might have very different background knowledge that we have in that particular way. But yeah, again, it's going to depend on the level of evidence. And I can see that it's not so much that I think that the probability of a miracle is unlikely, but I do think the probability of alternative possibilities is initially higher. So if you have a claim that has a low prior probability, and I know John is friends with Dr. Carrier, so he knows Bayesian epistemology to some degree.
I was about to say.
I can use words like prior probability and some Bayesian analysis. So I don't think I'll mind. But you can have a relatively low prior, and the posteriors for alternative possibilities are initially higher. You do have to consider those, but if you can rule those out systematically, or at least with a high degree of confidence, then I think that does help it. And so it really just depends on how easy it is to rule those alternative possibilities out. But yes, I don't think that I don't have an issue. In my background knowledge, I'm not a methodological naturalist, and I know that's a whole nother discussion that would probably take another 2 hours to just on that topic. But yeah, I think that if it's plausible, I don't think you'd have to demonstrate with like confidence that the supernatural exists, only that it's plot. If there's a 20% chance or so that that's there, then it's at least a theory we can throw out there. And even when I think John had mentioned this in the initial rebuttal when he said that you need to prove that you need to demonstrate the supernatural exists, or I don't know if he used the word demonstrate, but you need to be confident of that before you can posit it as a theory. And I would say that, well, we can have models that make predictions about it. So for example, before we discovered the Higgs boson, there were mathematical models that said, well, if these are correct, we should expect to find it here. You didn't have to say we have to find the Higgs boson before we can postulate it. You can hypothesize it before they found it. Same with the planet Pluto on mathematical grounds. So you can, in theory, make it have a theory that makes predictions without actually affirming it in advance. So I think you can say that if the supernatural or this model of the supernatural is true, here's what we would expect to find. And then if you do happen to find those, and it's more consistent with that data than it is with the alternative data, then that's what you'd have to take into consideration about that.
Well, so the problem that I have with that is it was my understanding that as far as miracles go and the supernatural, as far as God goes, is that it's not predictable. Like I feel like that's one of the prime components of the like this divine miracle sort of topic that we're discussing here is that and I believe that you had this in your opening slides that that the miracles are not guaranteed to happen.
Right.
God uses miracles to somehow express his love, which is maybe that's a totally different topic that we could discuss, but to express his love, but too many of them would take away our autonomy. And so what me as more my analytical mind, what that says to me is that miracles are not predictable. So like, Stacy can pray to find her keys. She may or may not find her keys. It's up to God as to whether or not she finds her keys because she prayed. Same thing with the child that has bone cancer. They could pray, and it's totally up to God as to whether or not he decides to cure that kid of bone cancer. And so, which I've never heard of any kid being cured of bone cancer or any serious disease like that. But I'm just saying that it seems to me like in the ways that you're talking about being able to predict like the planet Pluto or the Higgs boson, we cannot predict God's miracles. Like we can't predict which prayers God is going to answer in the affirmative.
Right. So I agree that we can't predict who God will heal, which is why, I'm sure you're aware there have been some studies they've done on, there's one particularly well-known one done on intercessory prayer where they had like a group of people they pray for and a group they don't, and they decide which one's going to get better, and neither of them got better. And I agree. I don't think you can say, well, we know God's going to answer these prayers, because you could say, well, maybe God doesn't answer it. You also can't rule out that those people are praying for themselves too, right, or their families. So a lot of methodological problems with that in general. But I agree with you that we can't predict who God would heal. But I was more talking about the framework and saying I would expect a world in which miracles, or at least credible ones, occasionally did happen in a way, and that they would happen in religious contexts to people immediately after either prayer or visiting a religious shrine or something that was explicitly in a religious context. So in that sense, I think we can say, what if they were to happen, what context would they happen? So I agree we don't know each individual, but like if we had a world in which there were and you might think this is the case, if there were no good verified accounts at all, or a world in which miracles happened in terms of would just autonomously without prayer, just kind of unicorns are popping into existence for no reason every once in a while, that I would not predict under theism in my model. So that I think would be a big challenge to predictions I was making. So it really depends on what your model is proposing. But I would say that if we have autonomous phenomenon that is not only just unexplained by itself, but only happens to this degree in a religious context, and goes against everything we understand in natural science, if we can trust that that did actually happen, those are the kind of the criteria I'm looking in terms of what I'd expect if God did do a miracle in this way. So if someone prayed and said, oh, my keys came back, I would say, well, I can't falsify that God didn't answer your prayers, because that's not falsifiable. But I can say if God did answer your prayers, as far as we can tell, he didn't do it in a way that seems counterintuitive to the normal regularities of nature, because we know people can find their keys without praying. So it wouldn't be the same kind of thing in terms of God vindicating this, where it's clearly standing out in terms of nature. So that's more what I was getting at. But that is a really good clarification, because there are people who will say, well, we just can't know the mind of God, right? God allows this, and who are we to know God? And that's fine if they want to say that, but then it does take away a lot of that predictive power. And that's why I would press against people who would argue that I do think we need to come up with a model of what God would likely do. So I actually am very much in agreement with John on a lot of those points. I think we both share that kind of Bayesian reasoning in that sense.
Yep, and just a couple of things here. John, I didn't know if you had anything to say to that. A few comments here that's, I think they're pretty decent as well. So like Daniel Lowry, sorry if I butcher your last name. I wasn't good at spelling bee. If prayer was always answered, that would seem to go against an agential model of prayer, and would seem to be better predicted by Eastern non-theistic view of prayer. Do you guys have anything to say about that specifically?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of problems with the whole concept of prayer, because I feel like this might seem like cringy atheist thing to say, but I kind of feel like prayer is asking God to change His plan, and it's always seemed a bit narcissistic in that kind of way, like, oh well, we know better than God, because like. For instance, a child has bone cancer and their family prays for them to be healed. It's like, well, who gave that child bone cancer? If God knitted us in the womb, God knows all of us, God has a plan for our lives, God planned for that child to have bone cancer. And so now people that care about that child are praying to that God, being like, hey, reverse your decision, heal my child of bone cancer. And so, I mean, I feel like the prayer model is yeah, well, I understand that it provides hope for people, and I'm not trying to take away hope from people whatsoever.
Sure.
But at the same time, I feel like prayer is what you do when there's no other options. And I have yet to see a verifiable instance of prayer having a real effect on reality. And I know that we've mentioned before in this chat the different medical studies that have been done on like heart transplant recipients. Is one particular one where they had varying levels of prayer going on, and it kind of seemed like those that were being prayed for ended up doing worse for whatever reason. I don't think that you can make too many conclusions about that, because it's one particular study that's been done on it. But I feel like prayer, as far as prayer being answered every single time, I would think that if God did love people like as much as people claim that He would, then I feel like it would be very hard for a loving God to either not answer or reply in the negative to a lot of things that people pray for, and He just simply doesn't answer. So I guess I have more moral issues with the idea of prayer and prayer being answered than I do as far as prayer having a supernatural effect on reality.
And Caleb, do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, no, I really like that answer. I agree with Daniel that I think if you had, well, I would generally agree that if you had like where the case where prayer was answered every single time repeatedly, in like laboratory settings, you could say maybe this is some natural phenomenon that seems like if we repeat these conditions, like lightning, we can repeat, and we know which conditions it occurs under. So you could say that if this is an agent with free will, then he can do whatever he wants. But if this is a mechanism that we can repeat under controlled conditions, then it's probably some natural phenomenon we just don't understand yet, right? So you could make that argument. Although I would say, at least to Daniel, that I think there are cases where if you still had that religious exclusivity, so let's say that if you were Catholic, which I'm not, but if you really believe that the Eucharist transforms into the blood of Jesus Christ, right? And let's say that you could verify this, and we could go in and look and see if the blood was actually blood and so forth. And we could do this every Sunday, every Mass, whenever it was called. That would be repeatable and so forth. But I think if it still only happened like in that context and it never happened just to wafers in general, unless there was some kind of really weird conditions in the chapel itself, which we'd have to control for, I don't think I would say that the fact that it occurred mechanically and repeatedly makes it any less remarkably a miracle from God. Because like, why is it only happening in this religious context and not something that we could do in a laboratory outside of prayer or something, right? So I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that, but I think John brings up a lot of really good emotional points about theodicy and answering prayer. And I do go into that in some of the work I do. And it's a really, I think, good question. It's something a lot of people bring up in terms of are miracles unfair to people, that God would answer some prayers and not others. But I do think that prayer is meant a lot of times for our own spiritual growth and humility. But I also think that it's plausible, and this depends on your view of God's foreknowledge. But if God does know the future, I think that he very well could have built the future in with our prayers in mind. And so God knows that John's going to pray for X on this particular date. And so God sets it to where on this particular date, it'll happen. Like how if you're out for an email, if you have an office, you have your automatic email reply. It says, oh, I'll be out for this time on vacation. Like you set it in advance for a particular time. God could potentially be doing that with that, knowing what you're going to pray for so that it lines up. I'm not saying that that's how he does it, but I think that's plausible. So, and that way you're not really changing God's mind. God is actually, in some cases, creating the universe with some of your prayers in mind so that he can answer them. So.
Well, I mean, I feel like that makes it quite indiscernible from, not praying at all. Because, I mean, if God is already crafting reality with, your foreactions or your future actions in mind, then I think that there's no way for you to discern whether or not God has answered your prayer or whether or not God is answering prayers in general. I mean, it just, I guess I have a really big issue with when people say God answered my prayer, because like, how do you know that it wouldn't have just naturally occurred without you praying? Like I just
depends on what it is. I mean, yeah, if it's like, as you said, like a bone cancer that didn't go away otherwise, and it like instantly went away when you prayed for it, like that would be, and we didn't have any other examples of this happening outside of prayer, that would be pretty, I think, decisive, or at least very good evidence for thinking something happened. But if it's something like finding car keys, which we know happens outside of the context of prayer, then you could say, well, how do we know this just wouldn't have happened? And this is people, I mean, you know Derek Lambert, right? Like people like who say, oh, I was an addict on drugs and Jesus saved me. And I'm not trying to dismiss anyone's testimony on that, but I wouldn't call it a miracle, because yes, there are people who get off of drugs without religion or God, and whatever you make of that, I don't think that's the best case we can point to because of that exact reason. So I'm not saying that God didn't answer their prayers, but I completely agree that kind of prayer answering, that would be unfalsifiable. But that's why I'm trying to stick to things that are more spectacular in terms of things that don't normally occur outside the context of prayer, like things that transcend, we don't want to say suspend, transcend natural law. So
awesome. And I bring up this comment one more time because there was another comment that came through that I think kind of brings this back as well. And that's from In Philosopher's Garb. GE, what non-circular argument do you have that all miracles claims are false? Testimony is usually innocent until proven guilty, so why should we think those reporting miracles are guilty? So in retrospect, I'm sure we can see from the other comments where it's history, there are too many things that are wrong, so it only works in the context of background knowledge about the world. So it's like, history has shown to be false because actual other claims about that same exact event in history have shown the actual historical data of what actually took place. So in regards to this, when it comes to testimonies from a historical sense, why, I guess ultimately the question is why should we automatically just assume for them to be guilty as non-reliable? Um, I guess that's ultimately the question he's getting at.
Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure what he means by non-circular argument. Like, I don't
I
think
wouldn't
I
take it.
presented.
No. I don't think he meant it like that. I think like it. What circular argument do you have that miracle claims are false? I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm saying like, do you have one that just by contrary is just not circular? Is
I
what
think he's saying
asking.
a lot of people who use like Humean arguments against miracles say that Hume is making a circular argument. So I think that's what
Oh.
he's doing.
Yeah,
He's
that
saying
wasn't towards you.
He's saying that
I-
John is doing, I think, is what that the question is.
I mean, I took it as him saying that I've been providing circular
Right.
arguments, which I don't think that I have been. But
No.
in any case, I come at this as from a very Bayesian point of view, because I feel like we all do a lot of Bayesian reasoning in our daily lives, just
Sure.
in general. And so, in my experience, my background knowledge is that, you know, the miracles that have been suggested in the past have either been explained naturally or they've been shown just simply not to have happened. And so, like, that's our base for it. And so, like, whenever somebody tells me about a miracle claim, my initial reaction to it is very skeptical and dismissive of it, because of the fact that the background information heavily points in the direction of all of these other alternative explanations for it. And I mean, and to point this back to Caleb's opening statements and everything like that, like like you can rule out most miracle claims as being true miracles. It's only this very small subset. So I feel like, with all of that in mind, it's more likely anytime anybody comes up with a miracle, or they talk about some kind of miracle, more than likely it's going to not be a miracle. But now, the important thing as far as Bayesian reasoning goes is that it doesn't mean that like miracles can't happen. A lot of people mistakenly think that that means that I'm saying miracles can never happen. What it means is that the evidence for the miracle happening would have to be substantially great to overcome our background knowledge. So, like, if there's any faith healers out there, if there's any faith healer that makes a claim that, like with the Leo Paris thing, that they healed somebody of this detrimental illness, and now they're fine. The proclivity of faith healers to be performative and lie about their faith healing accomplishments, and providing just bullseye cases and all this other stuff. I feel like anytime any faith healer claims that, more than likely it's going to be false. And until you can provide me with enough evidence to overcome that background information, that's where I'm going to stay. And so I don't see that as a circular argument. So hopefully nobody is taking me as being circular in that way. Or if I have been, maybe you could explain how I am.
So that goes back into the question where I was asking both of you the guys the questions. How many sources do we ultimately need? Now it's like when it comes to you need a lot of evidence, right, for that. So then the question would be like, how much evidence, or what would that
I
evidence
think
look
both
like?
of us agree that it's quality over quantity, all right? Like you can
Right.
have
Yeah.
50 witnesses who are just all smoking pot and doing stuff, who say they saw some in the sky, and that wouldn't be too much, right? But witnesses who are like studied and credible, who are observing this under controlled conditions, under conditions where it'd be very difficult for them to be mistaken, and they have a reputation, that 5 witnesses of that kind would be more valuable than 50 witnesses who just are not very credulous, who are very credulous in general. So it just depends.
That's a good point.
Circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah. By substantial, I did not mean like quantity. I didn't mean quantity. I just meant substantial in the way that it substantially overcomes this prior probability.
Gotcha. Well, no, that's good. No, that makes a good, perfect sense. And Caleb, I know that you had some other questions as well. I know we're actually about to wrap it up, and
I think I asked most of them.
Okay.
We covered that. We covered the prediction stuff. I think we covered the criteria in terms of other religions. I think, other than getting into like the methodological natural stuff, which I think would be a little tangential, would be a whole nother discussion. I think we mostly covered all the things that I wrote down. It wasn't like a exorbitant amount. You can even see that on the screen, but it's for the cause of life. But yeah, so I'm happy to finish up. If there's any other questions, or we want to wrap up, if John is, unless he had anything else he wanted to say.
John, do you have anything?
I mean, I feel like I covered a lot of stuff. I'm just where I'm at is that it's not impossible for miracles to happen. Analytically, like I typically try not to absolutely rule anything out. Just my own position is that there's overwhelming like background evidence and knowledge that makes it very difficult to prove miracles. And I don't know what the evidence would need to be in order to prove a miracle or the supernatural. I know that, it would just need to be very good evidence in order to overcome, our prior experiences. And I still have a problem discerning between, just false claims of miracles from actual miracles happening, because the false miracles that happen occur under the same kind of conditions that we've been talking about here. And I know that we can go through and logically analyze and see how they violate the criteria for miracles that Caleb presented. But I feel like a number of those things could also be applied to the things that Caleb had talked about here, like the Leo Paris thing. Without more information, I would be very hesitant to claim that to be a miracle. I feel like it's more than likely just another case of a faith healer selectively providing, a case that makes it seem like a faith healing, because that seems to be what all faith healers have done in the past. So that's just kind of where I stand on that. And that's all I got.
Cool. Awesome. And honestly, I'm surprised that you guys didn't go into historical testimony to justify the main miracle, which would be, with all of us, would be like Jesus and the resurrection or something like that. So that was.
Well, I think in fairness, it'd be really hard to do that without going into a whole historicity debate, because that's going to, other than just talking about Paul having a vision, it's going to be very difficult to appeal to anything like that.
Well, just for clarification, in case anybody wants to know, for that particular conversation, I would assume that Jesus existed in history. I don't know
exactly
if that's a concern.
And that's a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole deeper conversation right there.
Certainly you can accept Jesus existed and say he didn't resurrect. That's a fair point. But I presume that your view on the Gospels wouldn't change the fourth. We still would basically just be dealing with Paul either way, right?
I feel like Paul's our earliest account. So, that would be the account that we'd work with. I know a lot of people like to argue for the reliability of the Gospels, so I don't know where you land on that. But for me, Paul seems to be far earlier than the Gospels. And I think that most of the evidence kind of lies with Paul.
Yeah, I'm not Eric Manning, so you could. I know you've already talked about that before, but I'll save that conversation for someone else.
Well, cool. Well, maybe one day we can actually set that up and have that conversation.
Or we could do it on the conversation of a person who has the degree in New Testament textual criticism, or is getting it or whatever. The one who has the channel called Everything New Testament.
I'm nobody special. I actually am still working on it. So hopefully a PhD, but we'll see. But unless you guys got anything else, or unless anybody else in the comment section has any last minute, we're right around that hour and a half mark.
Yep.
So if anybody has anything else, if you haven't yet, go like and subscribe, which you have to in order to even leave a comment. I had it set up just for that because I didn't want to just let the trolls just in. They got to earn it by subscribing to my channel for at least 5 minutes. So that's how I'm going to do it for this one. But it's been good. It's been a real good conversation. Hopefully, definitely, we can have more conversations like this. And I don't have a headache from lack of sleep and lack of food. I'm just a little hermit just living under a rock. I got nothing going for me. No, just kidding. But I appreciate you guys so much. And if you haven't yet, both the links are in the description of this video specifically. And it was a I love this comment here. Very cordial discussion. And other people were like, thanks for the combo, guys. this is what I love to do. This is what I love to see. I love good, cordial, civil conversations. I do not like dumpster fires. That's why you don't see me on Discord or Clubhouse or.
Well, I like watching them, not being in them myself. But
yeah, but even it's like watching a dumpster that's on fire. It's like, sure, I like a nice fire, but I like a nice, cordial, simple.
It's like a train wreck you just can't look away from. It's like, oh, I'm looking through my fingers, but I'm still
yeah, that's a good way to put it. But yeah, and a lot of people's loving the conversation too. So maybe definitely we can do this again on the historicity method, how maybe we can determine a reliable historical method that we can maybe agree on and then go to, we'll just start like us three will just start our own little podcast here and we'll just do it here. And
wow, okay.
Eventually we'll get to the book of Revelation.
He can just drop his old channel and just do it. Yeah, podcast.
Just
drop it for a channel. Yes.
Everything you guys are doing, just drop it. Yeah. Just come to my channel. We'll do this all together. Right, it's all good. Well, cool. Well, awesome. Well, again, appreciate you guys so much. This has been a lot of fun. And I hope that we can definitely do these things again because, John, but like I told you before, I've been watching you for years. Caleb, we've talked many times. I think, we've talked like quite a few times, actually. We hold each other on Clubhouse and stuff like that and had conversations on stuff. So a lot of good things have been happening. And I'm hoping a lot of good things will keep happening for both of you because you guys definitely, I would say, know your stuff personally. So with that, we're going to go ahead and shut it down for here. But I appreciate everybody who has been watching. If you haven't liked the video yet, please do help this channel so that we can have more cordial conversations like this. Because I try to be as fair as I can, even if I don't agree with somebody. I think we can say that, right? But you don't have to answer that, even though you can nod your head. It's okay. But again, appreciate everybody and hope everybody has an amazing weekend. And see you next time. Take care.